After I learned how to use Ableton, my life completely changed for the better. I'm not even kidding. I've used it to make hundreds of thousands of dollars and tour the world as an artist, and you could potentially do the same thing, but first, you gotta learn the basics. In this video, I'm gonna show you all the ins and outs of Ableton that you'll need to know in order to write and produce the best quality music possible. So if you just downloaded Ableton and you need an experienced shaman to show you the ropes, I got your back. Go ahead and open up Ableton and we can get started. Usually when you open up Ableton for the very first time, it's gonna open with a demo song loaded to show you what it's capable of. You're welcome to tinker around with this for a while, but when you're ready, go ahead and hit File, New Live Set. Now we have a brand new project. First, we need to dial in your preferences to optimize your workflow and get you set up just like a professional producer. Editor Ethan here. Just realized that getting your settings dialed can seem kind of boring, but keep in mind that you only have to do this one time and it's gonna make your life so much easier. So just follow along and I promise it'll be worth it. Okay, back into Ableton. So go ahead and just press Command, comma, and that's gonna open up preferences. You can also click on Live and click on Preferences. First, we're going to go over to the Audio tab, and under the Audio Device section, we're going to select our input and output devices. If you have an interface, say an Apollo Twin or a Duet or a Scarlett, this is where you're going to select that interface. For this tutorial, I'm sending it to the screen recording software, and since I'm at home, I'm just using my MacBook Pro microphone, but this is normally where you would select your interface for both your output and your input. Next, you want to make sure your sample rate is 48,000. I usually select high quality here. And then for buffer size, you have a lot of options here. I would recommend staying between 256 and 2048. If you're experiencing a lot of glitching effects and it seems like your CPU is spiking a lot, then try increasing your buffer size so that Ableton has a little bit more time to process things and it'll be less glitchy. But for now, I'm just gonna stick with 512. We're not gonna worry about anything else here. We're gonna go down to the File folder tab and we're gonna turn off Create Analysis Files, because it's not really necessary. Next, head over to the Record Warp Launch tab. For file type, we're gonna make sure we have wave selected, and for bit depth, we're gonna do 24. Then we're gonna go down to Warp/Fades, and where it says Loop Warp Short Samples, we're gonna hit Unwarped One Shot. We're gonna make sure Auto Warp Long Samples is turned off. Just a quick note on this, basically all this is doing is saying when you drag in like a percussion loop or some sort of sample, it's gonna warp that sample and adjust it to the BPM of your song. So let's say you have a song that's at 120 beats per minute and you drag in a shaker loop that's at 140 beats per minute, it's gonna slow down that shaker loop and make it 120 beats per minute. The only issue is that sometimes it gets it wrong, and it also tries to do the same thing for certain effects and stuff that I actually don't wanna warp. So for me, I just leave it off, but it doesn't really matter because we can always change it later. For default warp mode, we're just gonna go with complex and create fades on clip edges turned off. Lastly, go to the very top tab here, look and feel, and you're welcome here to play with different themes. I like mid-light, and then you can adjust your zoom display here. I think 125 is great on this big monitor I have, but you can drag up to zoom Ableton in, and you can drag down to zoom Ableton out. Okay, that should be enough to get you started for preferences. Now let's dive into the actual tour of Ableton. To press play in Ableton, you just hit the space bar. The metronome and BPM are up here to the left. So if I click on the metronome to turn it on and then press the spacebar, you'll hear the BPM. And if you don't know what BPM is, it stands for beats per minute. And just think of it as the speed of the song. Now we can either click and drag here to change the BPM, or we can use the arrow keys to adjust it as well. Next, we're going to use the tab key to toggle between session view and arrangement view. This is session view, this is arrangement view. Now, if you're using Ableton to write and produce music, you're probably only going to use arrangement view. So if you ever get stuck on session view, just press tab, or you can click over here to the upper right and you can switch between session view and arrangement view. Session view is usually used for live performance stuff or DJing, so we're not really going to worry about that. Once you're in arrangement view, you'll see your tracks. This is where your sounds are going to live. I try to have a track for each sound type. So for example, I'll have a track for the kick, a track for the snare, a track for the bass, and that way I can adjust everything individually. Now there are two types of tracks in Ableton: audio tracks and MIDI tracks. MIDI stands for Musical Instrument Digital Interface. Just think of it as an instrument that's on your computer. Now, for MIDI tracks in Ableton, you're going to use the piano roll to tell the virtual instrument what notes to play. Let me show you what I mean. I'll teach you these hotkeys in a minute, but for now, I'm just going to blaze on through and create a new MIDI clip. But basically, MIDI is just a piano in Ableton with the notes here. And you can click and draw the notes in like this, and then press play, and it will play the notes. So within Ableton, we have this piano instrument, and then our MIDI clip is telling the piano which notes to play. Hopefully that makes sense. This brings us to our next topic, which is VSTs. VST stands for Virtual Studio Technology. VSTs can be anything from a virtual synthesizer like Serum or an effect like reverb or delay. An AU or audio unit is the same thing as a VST, but it's made exclusively for Mac. Now that you know about audio and MIDI tracks and VSTs, it's time to introduce you to the fades. These control the volume of your track. So if you look here to the right where it says 0, this is basically just the volume of the track. After I've clicked on it, I can use the arrow keys to turn these fades up and down. And you can hold shift if you want to get really, really specific. But I mix and master music for part of my living, and I almost never do anything more specific than a half decibel at a time.
I pay rent.
I
deserve to be here.
You can also just click and drag to adjust the volume, but my OCD really likes the 1 decibel increments. Also, you can press delete to just bring it back to 0. So we know how to control the volume of tracks, but what if we want to put effects on something? Okay, so here we have a snare track. It's just a dry snare. And we can go over here to the left where it says audio effects, go to the reverb tab, and then we can drag the reverb directly onto the snare track. This is part of why Ableton is so user-friendly. All you have to do is just drag your effects directly onto the track, and then once your effect is on the track, you can adjust the dry wet to decide how much of the effect you want. If you turn the wet all the way up, you're just going to hear the reverb, and if you drag the dry all the way up, you're just going to hear the snare. I would say probably 90% of the time you're going to be putting effects directly onto tracks with this method, but there is another method worth mentioning. Just below the fades, over here to the right, these are the sends. Now, all these do is they send the signal down here to the return tracks. On the return tracks, you can put various effects like reverb or delay. And I'm pretty sure the default is reverb on the first one, delay on the second. And the advantage of using the sends instead of dragging the effects directly onto the track is that you get 100% of the dry signal, and then you have the reverb on top of that. These are great specifically for vocals, as we can get the pure original vocal with some reverb on top of it, instead of using that dry wet feature on the regular reverb method, which pulls the vocals back in the mix as you turn the wet up. So in the case of the snare, we have the dry snare sound. And then as we turn this send up, it's sending the snare to that reverb return track. So now we have the dry snare signal, and we also have the reverb on top of it. Okay, take a deep breath. Don't worry if this feels like a lot of information. After a little while in Ableton, you'll get the hang of this stuff in no time. And now we know which tracks are which, how to adjust the volume, and how to apply effects directly on the tracks and using sends and returns. Next up, here are a few hotkeys and tips to get your production process completely streamlined. The first and most important hotkey is Command S. This is how you save. I save religiously, and you should get in the habit of doing the same thing. Ableton is great about recovering progress if you experience a crash without saving, but it's always a good idea to save very regularly just in case. It's also a good idea to save each project or session in a folder dedicated to sessions. Let me show you what I mean. Go ahead and press Command S, and then navigate to your specific sessions folder. Name your project whatever you'd like, and then just click Save. Something else you might want to consider if you're starting to write and produce music for a living is you want to back up all your stuff. That's where today's sponsor comes in. Nah, I'm totally kidding. But I use Dropbox and it's pretty good. So my sessions folder is in a Dropbox folder on an external hard drive. So I just work exclusively off of a hard drive, and that hard drive is linked to Dropbox. So anytime I'm saving, everything is being saved online so I don't lose anything. Okay, so let's say that you want to share this project with a friend, or you want to open it on another computer. All you have to do is go to File, Collect All, and Save. Just to be safe, I would make sure all of these are yes and just press OK. Now this is going to save all of the audio clips and all the little files into one project folder. So all the files are there and nothing is missing when you try to open it on another computer. It's good to get in the habit of pressing Collect All and Save. So that way all of your audio clips and everything are just in one project and you don't have to worry about losing it or trying to locate different files down the road. Trust me, it can be a big hassle. So Command S is to save, and that's standard on most programs. There are a few more standard hotkeys that I use all the time. I use Command C to copy, Command V to paste, and Command D to duplicate. To zoom in and out in Ableton, all you do is hover this mouse over this gray area right here, then you click and drag, and that'll help you zoom in and out. You can also move right and left, and if you look above this dark gray bar, there's a small representation of the entire project. So let's say we had a whole project here. We can use this top area and click to get to certain spots in the song really quickly. Okay, next up is Command J, and this consolidates. So what that means is it takes a bunch of clips and makes them into one clip. So you highlight the area you want to consolidate, you press Command J, and boom, there you go. Everything is made into one clip. The next two hotkeys are Command Z to undo and Command Shift Z to redo. I use this all the time to go back and forth with different effects. So let's say I want to put some reverb on this snare. I'll just turn the dry wet up. And then let's say I want to try a little bit less. I'll just drag it down. And then I'll just use Command Z and Command Shift Z to go back and forth. This is super helpful for getting effects just right. Okay, you're doing great. Just stick with me. We only have two more hotkeys, but they're super important. Command T is to create a new track, and Command Shift T is to make a new MIDI track. Command T, new track. Command Shift T, new MIDI track. So if you're going to drag in samples or record, that's going to go on the audio track. And if you're going to use a virtual instrument, that's going to go on the MIDI track. Now, please listen to me here. If you commit these to memory, it will cut your production time, like probably at the very least cut your production time in half. And that way you can spend more time making music and less time sorting through menus and all that. If you're enjoying this so far, please consider subscribing and give me the chance to teach and inspire you on a regular basis. I would really genuinely appreciate it. You might as well click the like button too, just to let YouTube know if all my hard work is worth watching. Okay, great. So we know some basics when it comes to adjusting sounds that are in Ableton, but how do we get sounds into Ableton in the first place? There are three methods to getting sounds in Ableton: samples, MIDI, and recording. They're all really simple and easy to get the hang of. For samples, it's as easy as drag and drop. I personally use Splice and my own sample packs for most of my samples. I would highly recommend getting an account with Splice because they just have so many great samples, but you can also scour the internet for tons of free samples. I actually have some great sample packs that I've made that you can get absolutely for free. I'll put a link to those in the description of this video. Okay, so to get a sample into Ableton, let's review. First, we're going to press Command T to create a new track for that sound. Then I'm going to go up to Splice. I'm going to find the sample that I want and just drag it right into Ableton. You can also click here to copy it, go into Ableton, and press Command V to paste it. Now, if you want all of your samples within Ableton so you don't have to use Splice, you can just go here to the left where it says Places, click Add Folder, select the folder wherever your sample pack is, and then after that, your sample pack will be right here to the left, and you can just drag your samples in like that. Okay, so that's samples. The next method is MIDI. For this, we're also going to use the drag and drop method, only we're going to drag an instrument from the plugins folder or the instruments folder. So remember, to create a new MIDI track, we press Command Shift T. And then over here to the left, we have our instruments folder if you want to use Ableton's instruments, or if you downloaded a third-party synth like Serum, you'll find that under plugins. Okay, I'm going to drag this E basic piano onto the MIDI track. Now we can either record MIDI or draw it in. If we want to record MIDI, we just want to make sure that the MIDI track is armed by clicking this little record button to the right. And if we click record up top here, it'll start recording and we can play in some notes. Or if we want to draw in notes, we can just get rid of this. We can highlight however long we want the MIDI clip to be and press Command Shift M, or we can just right click on that section and click Insert Empty MIDI Clips. Now to open the piano roll, you just double click on the top bar of this MIDI clip and it'll bring up the piano roll down here. Now, once again, all this piano roll is doing is just telling this instrument what notes to play. So I can go ahead and just draw in a chord progression. This is what the chords sound like. Okay, so that's just a simple way to draw chords in. Let's say we like the chords, but we want to adjust the actual sound of the instrument. Well, we can click on the MIDI clip and then press Command L to loop it. That way we can just play it over and over and then play with different settings to adjust the sound. This is a super helpful method when you're trying to tweak a sound and get it exactly how you want it. So now that you know about samples and MIDI, it's time to talk about the third and final method for getting sound into Ableton, and that is recording. Earlier, we chose our interface and our preferences and selected it as the output and the input for Ableton. After you've made sure to do this, we need to make a new audio track. Go ahead and press Command T, and then we're going to go ahead and arm this new track that we just made by clicking the little record icon. And then if we click record up top, we are now recording our voice. And if you look down here, we now have a recording. It's helpful to do a test recording to make sure that your levels aren't too loud or too quiet. You can also see how loud your levels are before even recording at all in this meter next to the fade area. If you see it right here, going up and down as I talk. If you want to hear your voice or your instrument or whatever you're recording as you're recording it, you can click on where it says in, or you can click auto. Both of them work. Just keep in mind that if there's a lot of plugins and tracks in your project, that can cause some latency with this monitor feature. Latency just means that there's a delay in the sound coming through. So to avoid this, I personally use the monitor feature that comes with my interface, the Apollo Twin. But if you're having a hard time with the latency, you can always just take one ear off so you can hear what you're singing or whatever you're recording. Now that you know how to record, how do you know the right levels to record at? Well, to be honest, there's no exact one-size-fits-all method for this, but there are a few tips to make sure you get a good recording. Tip number 1 is to make sure you're not peaking. So what you're going to do is record yourself singing or playing the loudest you're going to be during the entire song and make sure that there's no distortion. In Ableton, if it's distorting, it turns red, so it's easy to tell. The second tip is to make sure you're not too quiet. Make sure you have a good, strong signal coming through. Again, there's no exact number for this, but just use your best judgment to find the happy medium between peaking and too quiet. If you look here to the right, my voice isn't going up and into the red, and it's also not way down here. It's kind of towards the middle, maybe a little bit higher than that. The third tip is to try and record somewhere quiet. If you have a dedicated studio space, it's helpful to cover any flat surfaces with some sort of carpet or cloth to dampen the sound of your voice or instrument when it bounces off the walls. When you record, you want to record the original sound, not the sound after it's bounced off of something and then goes back into the mic. This is going to make a huge difference when we start mixing things and adding compression and that sort of stuff. You want the most pure signal possible with the least amount of background noise. Sorry for that little tangent, but it's important when you're recording. Okay, great. Now you know the 3 methods of getting sound into Ableton. At this point, you may not be an Ableton whiz, but you have all the information you need to use Ableton just like the pros do. I recommend giving yourself a little time to play around in Ableton, practice using some of the hotkeys, get used to making new tracks, dragging in samples, drawing in MIDI notes on the piano roll, and saving regularly. I know I threw a ton of information at you, so feel free to come back to this video whenever you need a refresher, and also feel free to comment any questions you have down below and I'll answer them there. You're not in this alone, and I'm here to help. And most importantly, remember to stop making excuses and start making music. Cheers.